My mom, aunt, and both sisters had breast cancer. My aunt died of it in our home when I was 5 years old. I still remember that day, the screaming and the crying that went on. It would set in motion for me a lifetime of trying to figure out how do I avoid that mess. When you've seen somebody up close and personal go through the ravages of chemo and radiation and all of the many things that happen to you once you are diagnosed with cancer, it really sets up this pattern of trying to figure out, what can I do differently? In some respects, I was lucky to be the youngest in my family because I had the opportunity to see what worked and what didn't work. And as an investigative reporter in television, I was always trying to figure out, how do I avoid this? What does the research say? So I read every book I could. I ran to the health food store when I almost died of a colon blockage at the age of 28 and read all 5 books on fiber because that's all there was at the time. I began at that point a macrobiotic diet because it was the same year my sister had been diagnosed with cancer. I remember showing up at her doorstep after reading the book Recalled by Life. I delivered that book to her, which was written by a doctor who had reversed his own cancer through diet. And I also delivered bags of beans, greens, and grains. And my sister said to me, "How dare you undermine my decision and the way I've decided to deal with my cancer?" It taught me a lot as I would go forward and begin teaching cancer prevention classes for the national nonprofit, the Cancer Project. I would see people in my class reverse diseases all the time. And indeed, there was one woman, Corky Carlson, who lost 120 pounds in 8 months, never counting a calorie and loving the food. She had also been diagnosed with one of the more fatal forms of cancer, multiple myeloma. Doctors didn't give her long to live, but 8 years later, she is alive and well and doing great and still loving the food. I have been focused on how to try and avoid cancer because that has been my perspective. The one sister I had who hadn't had breast cancer yet, who did have heart disease and diabetes big time since her 20s, was diagnosed with a herniated disc, so she went in for routine surgery. Don't you love that word? She flatlines on the table, getting MRSA entering in through the IV, and she is now a quadriplegic in a nursing home for the rest of her life. Do you see how all of these diseases are connected? It's not just one disease by itself. The other sister, who has had breast cancer 3 times, breastfed 4 children 6 months each, and that still wasn't enough to defeat or avoid breast cancer. As you can tell, I'm feeling like I'm a pretty marked woman. I became a La Leche League leader. That is a breastfeeding information and support organization. I did that for 6 years while I was a stay-at-home mom with my 3 daughters. And you know, now we know that breastfeeding is actually preventative, not only in the mother when you breastfeed, but it also is preventative in female offspring. So that's something that's was even more amazing to me, that so much of what we can do in our lifestyle affects the outcome. But as I said, in my family it wasn't enough. So that's another reason that I decided to stay on a plant-based, well-balanced vegan diet for the rest of my life. It seems to be, for me, running, as you can see from some of the awards that I've won, 51 to be exact, in 5K races for my age group where I placed. So this combination of running and a vegan diet have, I believe, at least for me, prevented breast cancer. Now, I don't know if I have the gene or not. I wouldn't do anything differently if I did. So I think it's important, though, to get as much information as you can. And unfortunately, the stories like with Angelina Jolie doing prophylactic mastectomies because of her family history give so much attention to that as being a solution. I can only wonder, and you certainly can't judge for anybody else how they make a decision, but I can only wonder how many people will opt for having their breasts removed as opposed to something so much simpler and easier than changing your diet. Unfortunately, most doctors don't get a single nutrition class in medical school. So how many doctors are out there saying, why don't you try doing a plant-based diet instead of having your breasts removed? You know, I avoided a hysterectomy by switching to a plant-based diet. You know, my path over the past 32 years has not been straight and narrow. I worked in financial services where I had no control over my diet and got away from eating a plant-based diet, and then found myself a second time in the emergency room following that colon blockage, facing a hysterectomy. I had hemorrhaging fibroid tumors, and the decision in the emergency room at that time was do a hysterectomy right now. But my regular obstetrician got on the phone and said, "Ellen, go back to that plant-based diet and call me in the morning." 3 weeks later, all signs of menopause were gone, even hot flashes. My husband, who was also an investigative reporter, was quite skeptical until he realized, because he would have his arm around me, that my hot flashes were gone. Gone. I didn't need the hysterectomy. How many women could avoid these drastic procedures if they had a doctor who said, "Go on a plant-based diet and call me in the morning"? Now, there are doctors out there who will tell you this. Look for them. Get a second opinion. And even though I don't want to suggest that I am giving you medical advice by any stretch of the imagination, look at my story. And if there are any doctors or researchers out there who want to study me, please find me at vegcoach.com, and I am willing to participate in whatever study you have to offer. Unfortunately, the only study I do qualify and participate in is the sister study. It's the only study I'm aware of where you don't have to already have breast cancer and you don't have to be willing to take a drug, which I am not. So I hope this information has been helpful to you. I say this with all due respect and compassion to any woman who's made the decision to have prophylactic mastectomies. But I say to others who are considering it, look at all your choices, look at all your options, look at me. A plant-based diet, exercise, can be magical.